What if a simple family photo from 1890 wasn't just a memory, but a trap? When a historian zooms into an old picture, he discovers a child who was never recorded, a face hiding in the window, and a terrifying truth: the photo is changing. And the worst part? Every time someone looks closer, a new person appears inside it. Watch till the end, because the final image might include someone you recognize. The rain had been falling all morning, tapping gently against the tall windows of the museum like quiet fingers trying to get inside. The building itself was old, almost as old as the items it held. Its wooden floors creaked with every step, and the air carried a faint smell of dust and time. Very few people visited anymore. Most preferred modern attractions, leaving places like this to be forgotten. Daniel didn't mind. He actually liked the silence. It gave him time to focus, to think, and to explore the past in a way that felt almost personal. As a young historian, he had always been drawn to things others ignored: old letters, faded photographs, and objects with stories no one remembered. That afternoon, he was working in the storage room at the back of the museum. It was a narrow space filled with shelves stacked high with boxes, each labeled with dates or names that meant little to most people. A recent donation had arrived a few days earlier, several boxes from an old estate that had been cleared out after its owner passed away. Daniel pulled one of the boxes closer and wiped a thin layer of dust from its lid. There was no label on it, which immediately caught his attention. Most items were carefully marked, but this one seemed to have been forgotten. He opened it slowly. Inside were small objects, old coins, a rusted pocket watch, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Nothing unusual. He examined each item briefly before placing it aside. Then, at the very bottom of the box, he noticed something flat, tucked beneath a piece of cloth. It was a photograph. Carefully, Daniel lifted it out and held it up to the light. The image was black and white, its edges worn and slightly curled with age. Even before studying it closely, he could tell it was very old, likely from the late 1800s. He brushed off a bit of dust and focused on the picture. A family stood in front of a wooden house. The structure behind them looked simple but sturdy, with tall windows and a narrow porch. The ground beneath their feet was bare, with no sign of grass or decoration. Everything about the setting felt quiet, almost too quiet. There were 5 people in the photograph. A man stood on the left side, tall and serious, dressed in a dark suit. Beside him was a woman, her hair neatly tied back, wearing a long dress that reached the ground. Her hands were folded in front of her, and her face showed no emotion. In front of them stood 3 children. 2 girls and 1 boy. The girls looked slightly older, standing straight with stiff postures, their expressions just as blank as their parents. The boy, however, was different. Daniel leaned in closer. At first, he couldn't tell why the image felt strange. But the longer he looked, the more unsettling it became. None of the family members were smiling, not even slightly. Their eyes stared directly at the camera, but there was something empty about them, like they were looking through it rather than at it. Then he noticed the boy. His figure appeared slightly blurred. It wasn't the kind of blur caused by damage to the photograph. The rest of the image was sharp and clear, every detail perfectly still. But the boy looked as if he had moved at the exact moment the picture was taken. That didn't make sense. Photographs from that time required people to stay very still for several seconds. Any movement would usually blur the entire image, not just one person. Daniel frowned, adjusting his grip on the photograph. Strange, he whispered to himself. He turned the picture over. On the back, written in faint, fading ink, were a few words. The Harrow family, 1890. The handwriting was uneven, as if it had been written in a hurry, or with a shaky hand. Daniel felt a small chill run through him, though he couldn't explain why. It was just a photograph, after all. An old family picture, no different from hundreds of others stored in the museum. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with it. He looked at the boy again. The blur wasn't random. It almost looked like the child was slightly out of place, as if he didn't fully belong in the scene. Daniel walked over to his desk and placed the photograph under a lamp. The warm light made the details clearer, but it didn't make the image any less unsettling. In fact, it made it worse. The shadows in the background seemed deeper now. The windows of the house behind the family looked darker than they should, as if something inside was blocking the light. Daniel shook his head, trying to ignore the thought. "You're imagining things," he said quietly. Still, he couldn't look away. There was a story here. He could feel it. And as a historian, that feeling was something he trusted. He reached for his notebook and wrote down the name, Harrow Family, 1890. If the photograph had ended up in the museum, there had to be some record of it somewhere, old newspapers, town archives, anything that could explain who these people were. But before putting the photograph aside, Daniel took one last look. For a brief moment, he thought he noticed something else. The boy's eyes. They seemed slightly darker than before. Daniel blinked. When he looked again, everything appeared normal. Just an old photograph. Just a family from long ago. He let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside him. Outside, the rain continued to fall. And deep inside the quiet museum, the forgotten photograph rested on the desk, waiting. Daniel didn't sleep well that night. The image of the photograph stayed in his mind, the still faces, the empty eyes, and most of all, the blurred boy. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it. A feeling that he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. The next morning, he arrived at the museum earlier than usual. The building was quiet, just like always, but today the silence felt heavier. He walked straight to his desk, where the photograph lay exactly where he had left it. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he picked it up again. Nothing had changed. The family stood frozen in time, their expressions unreadable. The boy was still blurred. Daniel placed the photograph carefully into a protective sleeve and headed toward the archive room. This was his favorite part of the museum, a place filled with old records, newspapers, and documents that held pieces of forgotten history. If there was anything about the Harrow family, it would be here. He began with the town registry. Pulling out a large, worn book, Daniel flipped through pages filled with names written in careful handwriting. Years passed with each turn until he reached the late 1800s. There. Harrow family. Daniel leaned closer and read aloud under his breath. Thomas Harrow, wife, Eleanor Harrow, daughters, Mary and Lila. He paused. There was no mention of a son. Daniel frowned and read the entry again, slower this time. But the result was the same. Only 4 names were listed. No third child. No boy. That's not possible, he muttered. He looked back at the photograph in his hand. The boy was clearly there, standing right in front of the family. So why wasn't he in the records? A strange feeling settled in Daniel's chest. He quickly moved on, searching for more information. Next, he turned to the old newspapers. Stacks of fragile papers filled the shelves, each one holding stories from a different time. Daniel carefully selected issues from the year 1890 and began scanning the pages. At first, there was nothing unusual. Reports of local events, small advertisements, and everyday news filled the columns. Then he found it. A headline caught his eye. "Tragedy strikes local family." Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he read the article. It described the sudden death of the Harrow family during the winter of 1890. According to the report, all members of the household had been found lifeless inside their home. The cause was listed as a severe illness, though no specific details were given. Daniel kept reading. The article mentioned Thomas Harrow, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 daughters. Again, no mention of a son. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The photograph clearly showed 3 children. But every official record only listed 2. Where was the boy? He continued searching, flipping through more newspapers from the same period. That's when he started to notice something strange. Some articles hinted at rumors. Short paragraphs, almost hidden between larger stories, spoke of neighbors who had heard unusual sounds coming from the Harrow house in the days before the tragedy. Whispers in the night. Footsteps when no one was outside. And one report that stood out more than the others. A neighbor claimed they had seen movement inside the house days after the family was believed to be dead. Daniel felt a chill run through him as he read the line again. A shadow was seen passing by the window, though no living person remained inside. He swallowed hard. This didn't sound like a simple illness. Something else had happened in that house. Daniel closed the newspaper and rubbed his eyes, trying to think clearly. Old stories often became exaggerated over time. People added fear and imagination to things they didn't understand. There had to be a logical explanation. But the missing child, that was harder to ignore. He decided to dig deeper. Moving to another section of the archive, Daniel searched for any personal records, letters, journals, anything connected to the Harrow family. After nearly an hour of searching, he found a small collection of documents tied together with string. The label was faded, but the name Harrow was still visible. Carefully, he untied the bundle. Inside were a few handwritten letters. Most of them were ordinary, discussions about daily life, small worries, and simple conversations. But one letter caught his attention. It was written by Eleanor Harrow. Daniel read it slowly. At first, it seemed normal. She spoke about the weather, the house, and her children. But as he reached the end of the letter, her tone changed. The writing became less steady. More rushed. "There is something wrong," she had written. Daniel's eyes moved quickly over the words. "He speaks to someone we cannot see. He laughs at nothing. Last night, I heard him whispering, but when I entered the room, he was alone." Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. "Thomas says it is just imagination, but I do not believe him. There is something in this house. I feel it watching us." The letter ended there. No signature. No date. Daniel slowly lowered the paper. He whispered. Was she talking about the boy? The child who didn't exist in the records? Daniel's thoughts spun as he tried to connect everything. A missing child. Strange noises. Shadows in the house. And a family that died under unclear circumstances. He looked back at the photograph again, focusing on the blurred boy. This time, something felt different. The blur seemed stronger. More noticeable than before. Daniel shook his head, stepping back from the desk. "This doesn't make sense," he said quietly. But deep down, he knew one thing for certain. The Harrow family story was not what it seemed. And the more he uncovered, the more it felt like he was getting closer to something dark, something that had been hidden for over a century. Outside, the sky had grown darker again, clouds gathering as if another storm was coming. Daniel glanced at the photograph one last time before placing it down. He didn't realize it yet, but he had already gone too far to turn back. Daniel couldn't ignore it anymore. All day, the photograph sat on his desk like it was calling him back. No matter what he tried to focus on, papers, records, or even simple tasks, his eyes kept drifting toward it. By evening, the museum had grown completely silent. The last staff member had already left, and the halls were empty. Only the soft hum of the lights and the distant sound of wind outside filled the space. Daniel stood up, locked the main door, and returned to his desk. If there was something hidden in that photograph, he needed to see it clearly. He carefully picked it up and walked to the small digital lab in the back room. It wasn't anything advanced, just a basic setup for scanning and restoring old images. But it was enough. He placed the photograph into the scanner, adjusting it gently so it wouldn't get damaged. His hands were steady, but his mind wasn't. "Let's see what you're hiding," he whispered. The scanner light moved slowly across the surface, capturing every detail. When it was done, the image appeared on his computer screen. At first, it looked exactly the same. The Harrow family stood in their fixed positions. The house behind them loomed quietly. The blurred boy remained just as strange as before. Daniel leaned closer. He zoomed in slightly. The details became sharper, the lines in their clothing, the texture of the wooden house, even the faint cracks in the ground beneath their feet. Still nothing unusual. He zoomed in further. Now he focused on the faces. The father's expression was stern, but something about his eyes felt off. They looked darker than they should, almost hollow. The mother's face was calm, but too calm. Her lips were pressed together tightly, and her eyes seemed distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. The two girls looked almost identical in their stillness. Their faces showed no emotion at all. Daniel felt a small knot form in his stomach. Then he moved the cursor toward the boy. He zoomed in carefully. The blur became clearer, but not in the way he expected. Instead of smoothing out, it revealed something more unsettling. The boy's outline wasn't just blurred, it was distorted. It looked like his shape didn't fully match the space around him. His shoulders seemed slightly uneven, and his arms appeared thinner than they should be. Daniel leaned even closer to the screen. "What?" he whispered. He zoomed in more. That's when he noticed it. The boy's feet. They weren't touching the ground. Daniel froze. For a moment, he thought it might be a trick of the light or a flaw in the image. But the more he stared, the clearer it became. There was a small gap, just enough to see that his shoes were slightly above the dirt. His breath grew shallow. "That's not possible," he said quietly. His hand hovered over the mouse, unsure whether to continue. But curiosity pushed him forward. Slowly, he moved the screen toward the background of the image, the house behind the family. He zoomed in on the windows. At first, they looked dark and empty, just as he had seen before. The glass reflected no light, giving the house an almost lifeless appearance. Daniel adjusted the brightness and contrast slightly. The shadows shifted. And then he saw it. A shape. Faint, almost hidden. Daniel's heart began to pound as he zoomed in further. The shape became clearer. It was a face. A woman's face. Her features were pale and still, her eyes dark and fixed directly on the camera. Her expression was cold, completely emotionless. Daniel felt a wave of fear wash over him. "That's not," he began, his voice barely audible. He quickly compared the face in the window to the woman standing in the photograph. They were not the same. The woman in the window had sharper features, deeper shadows around her eyes, and a gaze that felt wrong. Almost unnatural. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly, creating distance between himself and the screen. "How did no one notice this?" he whispered. His thoughts raced. This couldn't be a simple mistake. Photographs from that time didn't just capture extra people, especially ones who weren't there. Unless... Daniel shook his head. No. There had to be another explanation. Maybe it was damage to the image. Or a reflection. Or something caused during the development process. But deep down, he didn't believe that. He looked back at the screen. The woman's face seemed clearer now. Too clear. Her eyes appeared darker than before, almost blending into the shadows behind her. Daniel felt a strange pressure in his chest, like something wasn't right. He leaned forward again, unable to stop himself. He zoomed in one last time. The pixels stretched, the image becoming grainy, but the face remained visible. And then... Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The woman's lips. They looked like they were slightly curved. As if she was smiling. But not in a normal way. It was a faint, unnatural smile. Cold. Watching. Daniel suddenly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "No," he said sharply. The sound echoed in the empty room. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the screen from a distance. The image didn't move. Everything remained still. Slowly, he stepped forward again, his heart still racing. He looked at the photograph on the screen. Nothing had changed. The family stood as before. The boy remained blurred. The window looked dark. Empty. Daniel blinked several times, trying to steady himself. "Just your imagination," he muttered. But his voice didn't sound convincing. He saved the scanned image and shut down the computer quickly, as if closing it would erase what he had seen. The room felt colder now. Quieter. As he turned to leave, something made him stop. A feeling. Like he wasn't alone. Daniel slowly turned back toward the screen. It was black now, reflecting only his own faint image. Nothing else. He let out a shaky breath and forced himself to walk out of the room. But as he reached the doorway, he couldn't help but think about one thing. When he had first seen the photograph, he was sure there had only been 3 children. Now, he wasn't so certain anymore. Daniel tried to convince himself to stop. For hours, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the scanned image on his laptop. He had reopened it several times, each time hoping he would see something different, something normal. But every time, the same unsettling details appeared. The blurred boy. The dark windows. And the faint memory of the face he was sure he had seen. By midnight, he made a decision. If the records and photographs couldn't give him clear answers, then maybe the place itself could. The Harrow house no longer existed, but the land where it once stood still did. Early the next morning, Daniel packed his bag and set out for the edge of town. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and the air felt damp, as if rain had just passed through. The location wasn't hard to find. Old maps and records had given him a clear idea of where the house used to be. When he arrived, he stopped walking. The land was empty. A wide, open field stretched before him, covered in uneven grass and patches of dirt. No house. No foundation. No sign that a family had ever lived there. But something about the place felt wrong. The air was still, too still. Even the wind seemed to avoid this spot. The trees at the edge of the field stood quiet, their branches barely moving. Daniel stepped forward slowly. Each footstep felt heavier than the last. "This is it," he whispered to himself. He walked toward the center of the field, trying to imagine where the house might have stood. The photograph replayed in his mind, the position of the door, the windows, the family standing outside. He stopped. Right here. He was sure of it. A strange chill passed through him, even though the air wasn't cold. Daniel looked around, expecting to see something, anything, that could explain the uneasy feeling. But there was nothing. Just silence. "Maybe this was a mistake," he said quietly. He turned to leave. "Looking for something?" The voice came from behind him. Daniel froze. Slowly, he turned around. An old man stood a few steps away, watching him. His clothes were simple, worn with age, and his face carried deep lines that told of many years. His eyes, however, were sharp, and focused entirely on Daniel. I didn't hear you come," Daniel said. The old man gave a faint smile. "Most people don't," he replied. Daniel hesitated, unsure of what to say. Then he gestured toward the field. "I'm researching an old family," he explained. "The Harrow family. I believe their house used to stand here." The moment he said the name, the old man's expression changed. The faint smile disappeared. His face grew serious. "You shouldn't be digging into that," he said quietly. Daniel felt a small wave of unease, but he pushed forward. "Do you know anything about them?" he asked. The old man looked at the ground for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak. Then he sighed. "I know what people say," he replied. "Stories passed down. Things no one likes to talk about anymore." Daniel stepped closer. "What kind of things?" The old man glanced around, as if making sure no one else was nearby. Then he leaned slightly toward Daniel. "They say the Harrow family was normal, at first," he began. "Quiet, kept to themselves. But everything changed when she arrived." Daniel's heart skipped. "She," he repeated. The old man nodded. "A woman," he said. "No one knew where she came from. She just appeared one day and claimed she was a distant relative. The family let her stay." Daniel's mind raced. The woman in the photograph? Or the one in the window? "What happened after that?" he asked. The old man's voice grew lower. "Strange things," he said. "People started noticing changes. The family stopped coming into town. The children didn't play outside anymore. And at night..." He paused. "At night, neighbors heard things." Daniel swallowed. "What kind of things?" "Voices," the old man said. "Whispers. Sometimes crying. Sometimes laughing. But the strange part..." He looked directly at Daniel. "Sometimes, it sounded like more voices than there were people in that house." Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "That doesn't make sense," he said quietly. The old man didn't respond right away. Instead, he continued. "They also said the youngest child started acting differently," he added. "Talking to someone no one else could see. Laughing at empty corners. Answering questions no one asked." Daniel's breath caught. "The boy," he whispered. The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Boy," he repeated. "Yes," Daniel said quickly. "There were 3 children in the family, right?" The old man shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "There were only 2 girls." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "But, the photograph. There was no boy, the old man interrupted firmly. Silence filled the space between them. Daniel's hands began to tremble slightly. Then who, he started, but couldn't finish the sentence. The old man's expression darkened. No one knows, he said quietly. But some believe, whatever came into that house wasn't alone. Daniel felt the air grow colder. What do you mean? He asked. The old man stepped back slightly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. The family didn't die from illness, he said. That's just what they told people. When the authorities finally entered the house. He paused again. They found something wrong. Daniel leaned forward, his heart pounding. What did they find? The old man's eyes locked onto his. They said the bodies were different, he replied. Not harmed. Not injured. Just empty. Daniel's breath grew uneven. And the woman, he asked. The old man shook his head. Gone, he said. No trace of her. No record she ever existed. A heavy silence followed. Then the old man leaned closer one last time. Some say she was never human to begin with, he whispered. Daniel felt a chill run through his entire body. Before he could respond, the old man straightened up and stepped back. You should leave this alone, he said. Some things are better forgotten. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Daniel stood frozen in the field, watching him disappear into the distance. His mind was racing. No boy in the records. A woman with no identity. A family found, empty. Slowly, Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out the photograph. His hands shook as he looked at it again. The Harrow family stood in front of their house. 2 parents. 2 girls. And 1 blurred boy. Daniel stared at the image, his heart pounding louder than ever. Because now, he knew one thing for certain. That boy was never supposed to be there. Daniel didn't remember how he got back to the museum. The walk, the road, the passing cars, everything felt like a blur. His mind was stuck on one thought, repeating over and over again. There was no boy. And yet, the photograph clearly showed one. By the time he reached the museum, the sky had turned dark again. Thick clouds covered the sun, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. Daniel unlocked the door with shaky hands and stepped inside. The silence hit him immediately. It felt deeper than before. Almost unnatural. He quickly locked the door behind him and walked straight to his desk. The photograph was still there, exactly where he had left it. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at it. I need to be sure, he whispered. Slowly, he picked it up. At first glance, everything looked the same, the parents, the 2 girls, and the blurred boy standing in front. But something felt different. Daniel leaned closer. His breath caught in his throat. There were now 4 children in the photograph. He stepped back suddenly, his chair falling behind him with a loud crash. No, that's not possible, he said, his voice trembling. His eyes rushed back to the image. The family stood as before, but now, beside the blurred boy, there was another child. A small girl. Her figure was faint, almost like she had just appeared. Daniel's hands began to shake uncontrollably. This wasn't here before, he said, louder this time. He knew it. He was certain. The photograph had changed. His heart pounded as he placed the image under the desk lamp. The light revealed every detail, and made the new figure clearer. The girl stood slightly behind the others, her face pale, her eyes dark. And just like the rest of the family, she was staring directly at him. Daniel stumbled back, his breathing uneven. "This can't be real," he muttered. His mind searched desperately for a logical explanation. Maybe he had missed it before. Maybe the image had always been like this. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Something was happening. Something he didn't understand. Trying to calm himself, Daniel rushed to his computer and pulled up the scanned version of the photograph. The screen flickered as the image loaded. He leaned forward, his eyes wide. The scanned image had also changed. 4 children. Not 3. Daniel felt a wave of panic rise inside him. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. His thoughts raced back to the old man's words. There was no boy. Then who were these children? Before he could think further, something else caught his attention. A notification on his computer screen. A news alert. Daniel frowned and clicked on it. The headline appeared. Local child reported missing near museum area. His stomach tightened. He opened the article. The details were recent, just a few weeks old. A young girl had disappeared not far from the museum. Authorities had searched the area but found no trace of her. Daniel's eyes moved to the attached photo. And everything inside him froze. The girl. It was the same girl now standing in the photograph. Same face. Same eyes. Same expression. Daniel's hands trembled as he leaned closer to the screen. "No," he whispered. He quickly turned his head toward the photograph on his desk. The girl was still there. Standing with the Harrow family. As if she had always belonged. Daniel felt a cold wave of realization crash over him. "They're not from the past," he said slowly. His voice shook. "They're still taking them." The room suddenly felt colder. Darker. Daniel swallowed hard and forced himself to look at the photograph again. Something else had changed. The blurred boy was no longer blurred. He was clear now. Perfectly clear. Daniel's heart raced as he stared at the boy's face. And then he noticed it. The boy's expression had changed. He was smiling. A slow, unnatural smile. Daniel stumbled backward again, nearly losing his balance. "This isn't happening," he said, his voice breaking. But it was. Right in front of him. The photograph was no longer just an image. It was something else. Something alive. Suddenly, the lights in the museum flickered. Once. Twice. Then went completely still. Daniel's breathing grew louder in the silence. He didn't want to look at the photograph again. But he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he turned his head. And his heart nearly stopped. All the figures in the photograph were now clearer. More defined. More real. The parents. The girls. The boy. And the new child. All of them were staring directly out of the image. At him. Their eyes felt aware. Watching. Waiting. Daniel felt a strange pressure in his chest, like the air was being pulled out of the room. He took a step back. Then another. "I have to leave," he said quickly. He turned toward the door. But something made him stop. A reflection. In the glass of the computer screen. Daniel slowly turned his head back. His eyes widened. The reflection showed him standing in the room. But he wasn't alone. Behind him. There were figures. Faint. Still. Standing close. Too close. Daniel's breath caught as he tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Slowly, very slowly, he turned around. The room was empty. No one there. Nothing behind him. He spun back toward the screen. The reflection was normal again. Just him. Alone. Daniel stood frozen, his heart pounding violently. Seconds passed. Or maybe minutes. He couldn't tell anymore. Finally, with shaking hands, he looked back at the photograph one last time. And his blood ran cold. There were now 5 children standing with the Harrow family. 5. Daniel counted again, just to be sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. His breathing stopped. Because one of those children looked exactly like him. Same face. Same eyes. Same expression. Standing among them. Perfectly still. Daniel's vision blurred as fear took over completely. He stumbled backward, his body weak, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. "No," he whispered. But it was too late. The photograph had already changed. And somewhere, deep inside that image, Daniel had become part of the Harrow family. Forever.